Both of our next panelists have extensive experience, albeit very different experience, working in large organizations. And so I look forward to hearing from each of them about that experience and expertise that they've gained over the years and what they might have by way of advice for guiding us forward in the crisis in which we find ourselves. I will introduce them each as they speak. You're free to speak from your chairs or to come down here. I'll vacate the podium once I've introduced you. But, our first presenter will be Dr. Jonathan Reyes. Dr. Reyes is the Executive Director of the Department of Justice, Peace, and Human Development for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. He was educated at the University of Michigan. There's a Michigan theme to this event, I've noticed. Where he studied European history. He earned a PhD in European history at the University of Notre Dame, which is close to Michigan, writing his dissertation on the historical vision of Christopher Dawson. In 2009, Dr. Reyes became the president and CEO of Catholic Charities in the Archdiocese of Denver. In 2005, Dr. Reyes had helped found the Augustine Institute in Denver, a graduate program devoted to Catholic theological studies and leadership training. He served as the first president of the Augustine Institute. He also previously served as the vice president for ministry and formation for the Fellowship of Catholic University Students, Focus, and taught the history department at Christendom College in Front Royal, Virginia. He is a faculty fellow here at the Institute for Human Ecology, I believe, at the Catholic University of America. Dr. Jonathan Reyes.
I'm going to use the podium because I'm so tall. It just makes it work a lot easier for me. So I've been given about 25 minutes, and I'll honor that, to offer some reflections on what might the laity do. What can the laity do? First, let me thank President Garvey, who just left, but for inviting me to participate in this. Stephen, thank you, and thanks for running the Catholic Project. It's an important initiative for reasons I'll make clear later. Let me just begin with a little bit of context about what I do for the Bishops' Conference, at least as regards this crisis moment. I have some particular responsibilities I've taken on. I have the privilege, and I mean that, of reading a great deal of the correspondence that comes into the office related to the abuse crisis. I find it a privilege because it keeps before me daily the suffering that sexual abuse has caused in the Church, starting first and foremost with the stories of the victim survivors. Only by keeping those stories in the forefront of our minds can we imagine responses to the current moment that are equal to the evil that's been revealed. I also consider it a privilege to read many suggestions for what the Church can do that come from laity and priests around the country. Everybody has an idea. These include spiritual recommendations as well as material ones, from prayer, fasting, suffering for others and with others, to lay commissions, to clinical practices and business practices. My reflections today are informed by these letters. Finally, I consider it a grace and a privilege to read these letters because, along with countless conversations, they've revealed to me the range of personal experiences people have in response to the crisis. In short, what I mean by that is this. You cannot predict how someone is going to respond to current revelations ahead of time. The sort of categorical political categories and other things you'd think about someone, regular mass goer, et cetera, they don't quite apply. It's a very personal reality how people respond to these, and so I've learned the best thing to do is listen for the first 10 minutes. Before I turn to my specific thoughts and recommendations in these areas on what the laity can do, let me offer 3 disclaimers. Disclaimers are always important, especially when you work for bishops. Number 1, because one likes to keep one's job. I need to feed my 7 children. I'm not a theologian or a canon lawyer, but as I will touch on questions related to those fields, I do so with an openness to being corrected. This is a helpful exercise, I believe, as one of my main contentions today, one of the things I'll argue, is that in order to answer the question of what can laity do well, in order to get a good answer to that, many laity, in fact, myself included, need to become more familiar with the Church's law and ecclesiology. A lot of the things I read show a lack of that understanding, and we need to enhance that. My second disclaimer is simply that although I work for the bishops, I am not speaking for them. I repeat, I am not speaking for them. My reflections here are entirely my own. I offer these thoughts as a layperson who lives in a parish community, has been involved in numerous apostolates, has also been in wide-ranging consultation on the nature of and possible responses to the crisis from professionals all over the country, from lay groups like the National National Advisory Council of the Bishops, other groups as well. I've been in countless hours of conversation about this. So that's where my reflections come from. So here, to my thoughts. The question, what can laity do, I find actually quite complex. It would seem to offer an easy answer. It doesn't. It strikes me that in order to answer it well, it's necessary to combine knowledge of some key theological, canonical, ecclesiological, historical issues, as well as good business practices, the advice of clinicians, etc. In other words, to answer that question well actually requires a wide range of knowledge. Given this, what I propose is that I don't answer the question exactly what can laity do first, but what I attempt to do in my short remarks is answer the question, what are the preconditions of answering that question well? What is it that laity should do in order to be able to answer the question, what can laity do well? My reflections are under three headings. The first, the intellectual formation of the laity, which is appropriate here at the Catholic University of America. The second, the depoliticization of the conversation. And the third, the fostering of helpful spiritual and moral dispositions. I'm going to try to bring around an array of reflections on sort of the preconditions of a healthful conversation. First, the intellectual formation of the laity, and I'll warn you now, this is a long section, so when I get to the end of it, you don't despair that he's going to go on and on forever. The first condition for a successful conversation involves our own intellectual formation. Any attempt to answer the question, what can laity do, should stem from at least a basic familiarity with the theological definition of the Church, a basic familiarity with the role of clergy and laity as articulated in two ecumenical councils in the last two revisions of canon law, a deeper reflection on the Bible itself in an effort to gain God's mind, so to speak, on how reform works, and some rudimentary knowledge of church history. There are other areas, but I've chosen those four. This is not a call for expertise. We don't all become experts in these areas, thank God, but merely for an intelligent familiarity. Let me comment briefly on each of these. First, with regard to the definition of the church, and some of this was covered by archbishops, so I'll skip it. Many Catholics, when they refer to church out of habit, refer to it as though it was something outside of themselves. They ask questions like, when is the church going to get it? When is the church going to do something about it? Or I agree or perhaps disagree with what the church teaches. As one theologian has said, in many of these cases, what is meant by the church is really the hierarchy. What is a hierarchy? And I'm told by some of my priest friends that when they use similar expressions, some do, they're referring to the bishops. Again, as something outside of themselves. But of course, the church is not reducible to the hierarchy. And so these habits of speech we really need to address. The church is a living organism built of living stones. It's the body of Christ. It's a common good, something that pertains to all of us and therefore and necessarily to each of us. Everything that affects one affects all. So the starting point for any consideration of what laity can do must be rooted in the clear sense that laity are not accidental to that church over there, the services of which they avail themselves on Sunday and for special occasions. Roles may differ, but the church is us. In addition, it's important to understand that the church is not simply a human institution. It's also transcendent. Thinking about the church in its human dimension is often helpful when it comes to practical recommendations, and a lot of the recommendations I get from laity are professionals, and they're extremely good. We do well to listen to them, legal scholars, clinicians, businessmen and women, organizational experts, etc. It's extremely helpful, and we do well to take some on, to be honest. But one must also never forget that the church is also a transcendent reality. It partakes of the mystery of the incarnation itself. It is both a human structure and the body of Christ. This means that while protocols and charters and human resource practices, a lot of what I spent my time working on, by the way, are necessary for an abuse-free church, perhaps, but they will never be sufficient to create a fully healthy, thriving church. It is possible, after all, to largely rid the church of clerical abuse and yet still be left with a somewhat dead thing, a safe human organization, perhaps, but with a diminished life in Christ. Again, that's not to downplay these practical things. We actually need them. Because of its nature as a spiritual reality, when the church is sick, it's sick in a spiritual way. And the means of its healing must include a spiritual response. When we see infidelity in the church, seemingly pervasive sin and failure, we're right to ask, what is the spiritual sickness that has weakened the church and allowed for this kind of far too widespread behavior? After all, the sexual abuse crisis reveals more than a few instances of people committing sins in a moment of weakness. It's also, in its horrific details, reveals a level of darkness that can only be described as demonic. Despite the debates over the causes of the crisis, as many of you are well aware of them, it is clear to just about everyone that behind the abuse itself, there are deep spiritual maladies. Identifying those spiritual maladies are key to our purpose, lay or clerical, and we need to develop spiritual remedies in addition to material ones to address them. Another area for better formation has to do with the idea of co-responsibility. This word gets thrown around a lot. A lot of words get thrown around a lot in our conversations, and they really need definition. Here, a familiarity with the two most recent ecumenical councils and some parts of canon law is again very helpful. Clarity about what it means that the laity share in the threefold munera of Christ as priest, prophet, and king is necessary for understanding co-responsibility. So is an understanding of the rights and duties of bishops, priests, and laity as articulated in canon law. There's a lot of rights. A clear understanding of co-responsibility also requires clarity about the shared mission of the church. I think this is important, and I'm stealing this from Father Michael Sweeney, a Dominican on the West Coast. The Second Vatican Council's decree on the laity defines the mission of the church and the role of all its members as follows. Forgive a slightly lengthy citation. This is what the church is for. The church was founded for the purpose of spreading the kingdom of Christ throughout the earth for the glory of God the Father, to enable all men and women to share in his saving redemption, and that through them the whole world might enter into a relationship with Christ. All activity of the mystical body directed to the attainment of this goal is called apostolate, which the church carries on in various ways through all her members. No part of the structure of a living body is merely passive, but has a share in the functions as well as the life of the body. Indeed, the organic union in this body and the structure of its members are so compact that the member who fails to make his proper contribution to the development of the church must be said to be useful neither to the church nor to himself, end quote. It's from paragraph 2. In other words, the duty to fulfill the fundamental mission of the church is a duty for laity and laity, for clergy and laity. They do it together. They're co-responsible for it, and it requires their collaboration. This is what it means to share responsibility. It's also important to note in light of this that the health of the church internally, and this is my experience, the health of the church internally is tied directly to the fulfillment of its mission. In other words, internal reform and effective mission go hand in hand. Healthy mission leads to a holier church, and holier church leads to more effective mission. This suggests, I would posit, that for many laity, the best thing we can do for the sake of the church in the midst of the present crisis is to continue to serve its mission, that, quote, the whole world might enter into a relationship with Christ, end quote. In order to do that well, we need to personally pursue the holiness that testifies to the love of a good God to a world grown skeptical of religious rhetoric. A life of holiness that brings life, that makes the argument for us. I'm not suggesting that the only role of the laity is in reform and is external mission. Many laity are key to internal reform, as you heard from the Archbishop, and I've experienced in working with the bishops on review boards, as excellent counselors, as people who've weighed in on any number of things. I wish merely to argue that in answering the question, what can laity do, we actually can answer it in ways that go beyond simply serve on a review board or directly address the crisis in some particular way. The intellectual formation of the laity should also include deeper meditation on sacred scriptures so as to deepen our ability to see God's way of dealing with his people. This is kind of a spiritual point and it's kind of obvious, so let me just offer a personal reflection to make this point. I found that reading the prophets in particularly has helped me through the last couple months. I don't know if you remember when everything broke on the McCarrick case, all the daily readings, for those of you going to daily mass, were from the prophets, Ezekiel 34, and I say this against the shepherds kind of thing. It was pretty robust. And I found it a consolation to read those things, not just because I was angry, for other two reasons as well. First, it just reminded me with the deep conviction that all this discipline that we're going through as a church at this moment is from God. It's an act of severe mercy for the sake of purifying this church, and that we can trust him with it, and trust that he will see that it's taken to its completion. This is consolation. I also found reading Scripture to be practically informative. For example, in just about every litany of the failings of God's people when they're about to be judged, one of the key pieces in just about every single one in the prophets includes failure of God's people to take care of orphans and widows. Therefore, the prophets say, if you're going to restore right relationship with God, if you're going to reform this people, you need to double down, return to, commit yourself wholeheartedly again to taking care of the poor and those in need in your midst. So let me suggest that one practical thing we can do as laity, doesn't depend on permission from bishops or anyone else, is we can double down on our commitment to serve those in most need around us. It's one of the great gifts of the present pontificate, to remind us of this again and again. I had the privilege of running at Catholic Charities. Before that, I was a professor. It changed my life to step into understanding what goes on in Catholic Charities. And I made it as CEO of Catholic Charities one of my jobs, that every week I'd go spend time with one of the ministries, just to see these things. It's remarkable what authentic, genuine, self-sacrificial love of those most in need can do for us, can do for the church, can do for the church in the world, and can lead to renewal. This is what Pope Francis calls encuentro, the Spanish word meaning encounter. In Spanish, it's got a rich meaning. It means to really engage someone, to somehow speak to them, communicate with them. And it means us to have an encuentro with all those on the margins. I think this is actually a way of addressing reform. In addition to the study of Scripture, some familiarity with church history is also helpful for developing ideas for effective lay action. History is teachable as an example. One doesn't want to say that history is simply repeated, but one can say with Mark Twain that it sometimes rhymes. And so it's worth looking at things like the 16th century and gaining some perspective on fundamental questions like, when is reform reform and when does it turn into revolution? One of the things we want to keep our eye very closely on. It's an important distinction. I think it's also important, and we can learn things from looking at the history of the engagement of laity in the church. There's already been a session in the Catholic Project on this. I would simply point out that the role of laity in the church has changed over time. And there are things we can learn about possibilities for lay engagement, even at some governance level, that are nonetheless well within the ecclesiology that was explained by the Archbishop. And so history provides us with a lens through which to see these questions in a more broader way. My second major point, the depoliticization of the conversation. To state it bluntly, we need to prevent the political concerns, church politics often, that are often embedded in the current conversations about the crisis from hijacking the discussion and limiting the available answers to our questions. The terms clericalism and the 60s or sexual revolution, for example, both legitimate considerations in any serious reflection on root causes, in my view, have come to represent more than different aspects in a broader narrative of how we got here. They're now representative of a whole set of assumptions about the church and have become freighted with many issues that are not necessarily related to the task of identifying causes of the crisis. They can be distractions because they've been politicized. It's nothing new or remarkable to say this. Many others have and continue to say it. You can't pick up a commentary these days without someone saying that. My point here is that we simply need to overcome it. Both clericalism and the sexual revolution, and perhaps other spiritual influences as well, consider one candidate perhaps the love of money and comfort. They demand our consideration as causes. We gain nothing by excluding one or the other out of hand. I don't pretend to think that simply using the words both and will resolve all the genuine disagreements that are out there. But I do hold out hope that a longer, more patient, and depoliticized conversation that considers multiple factors can get us a lot closer to more comprehensive and therefore more effective solutions. At least it's worth testing the hypothesis. Let's at least try. By the way, this is why the Catholic Project initiative here at CUA is so important. I believe it's attempting to create a space for precisely that kind of conversation. Third, the fostering of helpful spiritual and moral dispositions. Again, in order to answer this question well. There are certain spiritual and moral dispositions that are necessary for answering the question of what laity might do. I don't want to moralize or sermonize. We've had two of those. No, just one from Stephen. There's been enough of that already. But let me simply state a few truths that we all know. These are truths we all know, but perhaps it's worth just putting them on the table and looking at them together in a setting like this. First, we have to remember that even with our best efforts, the work of reform in the church is entirely dependent on God's grace. He's the reformer. We cooperate with him. And so in addition to working hard for reform, we also pray for reform. In the grand scheme of things, prayer is frankly the most efficacious activity we can actually undertake. Second, as Pope Francis keeps reminding us, we need humility. The polarization we face in the church can only be overcome by a position of true humility. Easy to talk about, hard to attain. Third, we need to combine the sense of urgency which many of us feel with the virtue of perseverance. If the Bible and history are any indicator, reform is a hard and long work. I was reminded of an insight by historian Christopher Dawson. After listing a litany of abuses in the church of the 16th century, he concluded with this helpful, if not necessarily hopeful, observation. Quote, "Everyone recognized the existence of these evils, and everyone demanded their reform. But so many vested interests were involved and so many legal precedents, privileges, and exemptions existed that every attempt at reform was frustrated again and again." End quote. I won't end there, but it's worth realizing how hard reform is. There are some things we can do in short order, some basic efforts at reporting abuse, for example, we've been working on. But reform that gets to the root of the problem takes time. This is why, among other things, it's extremely important that we as lay people continue to make our voices heard, that we continue to exhort and admonish and propose and call for efforts for reform. To the earlier question, ask again, bring it up again, bring it up to someone else, propose something. We have a right to be heard. That's actually a right of the laity. We also have a duty, and that duty is to make sure that efforts at reform do not slacken and that this issue is not dropped from popular sight. Let me close with a brief story. I recently asked a college campus minister at a large secular East Coast university about how the crisis had affected his efforts at evangelization. I just read this article by the Washington Post, one of many, on Catholics leaving the church and why they're leaving, etc. So I said, "Hey, how's evangelization going?" His response surprised and encouraged me. He said that at first the scandalous revelations about the church made evangelization, especially as a Catholic, extremely difficult. He spoke of people ceasing to participate in campus ministry events, not listening to him, walking away, ending conversations with one quick line, "I know about you people," kind of thing. But he then shared that after the campus chaplain held a series of town hall type meetings in which not only Catholics but many non-Catholics came to hear from the chaplain about the abuse crisis and to answer questions, he said after that the work of evangelization actually started to blossom, and it was actually thriving right now. Although he's not exactly sure why, he's convinced that through honestly facing the issue of abuse with a calm if urgent tone and being as transparent as possible, the chaplain actually enhanced the credibility of the gospel and of the church. This confirms some polling we've done as well about people who hear from their local priest about the abuse crisis are more likely to see a way through it and more likely to express in renewed credibility in the church. Is a simple if important reminder in this story. Although the reputation of the church is severely damaged, and although many people have the feeling that more revelations are coming, the good news of Jesus Christ is still good news. It's good news not for the sake of the church as an institution, but for the sake of the redemption of the whole world. In Christ, healing the breach of trust is in fact possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Teresa Sullivan, who is our next presenter, served as the 8th president of the University of Virginia from 2010 to 2018, the first woman to hold that position. She arrived at the University of Virginia from the University of Michigan, where she was provost, I'm not making it up, where she was provost and executive vice president for academic affairs. Prior to her work at Michigan, she was executive vice chancellor for academic affairs for the University of Texas system and a faculty member at the University of Texas at Austin. She was a graduate of Michigan State University's James Madison College and earned her doctoral degree in sociology from the University of Chicago. She is married to Douglas Laycock, the Robert E. Scott Distinguished Professor of Law at UVA, and they have 2 sons. President Sullivan is a respected scholar in labor force demography, the author and co-author of 6 books and many scholarly articles. She's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Dr. Teresa Sullivan.
Thank you. President Garvey initially contacted my husband about this conference, which I thought made sense, because while my husband is not Catholic, he is one of the leading thinkers in the country on religious liberty. Turned out President Garvey wanted to know how to contact me. But I don't think I particularly am suited for this conference, and I told him so. I have been at secular institutions all my life. I don't have a theological background. I am a practicing Catholic. But he said he felt that it was important to have a sociological lens put on the crisis in the church. And, so for that reason, I'm willing to do this. I will say that, like presidents of many universities, I have had to deal with Title IX in recent years, and particularly with trying to deal with issues of sexual assault in the demographic that we are most likely to have on our campuses, the 18 to 24-year-olds. Title IX has been very difficult, in part because it's a quasi-legal system, and yet everyone expects it to have all the same safeguards and procedures of the legal system. And threading away between what is required and what's not permitted has proven to be difficult, even with the best will towards the survivors or victims in mind. And by the way, I'm going to switch back and forth between the terms survivor and victim. And I don't mean anything in particular by the emphasis on either one, but it is important to note that many of the people who suffered sexual abuse view themselves as survivors. They got through it. They came through on the other side. They're not merely victims without agency. One of the reasons that universities have become a focal point for enforcement against sexual abuse has been that in the American legal system, it is nearly impossible to get a conviction for rape, or indeed for other forms of sexual misconduct. And frustrated victims organized and began to look for intermediary organizations that could remedy the situation. The military was one example, workplaces are another with claims of hostile environment, and another one is the universities. So against that backdrop, it's not surprising that the church itself became viewed as one more intermediary organization that could be used in the same way to try and bring about justice. So I'm going to talk about the church in that sense as an intermediary organization. But the church is different from the military and workplaces and universities because the church explicitly proclaims an ethic of sexual morality. It forbids sexual activity outside of heterosexual marriage, and among the clergy requires a vow of chastity, so there is no sexual activity legitimately at all. There's no question that the revelation that many priests have had sexual activity, and they've had sexual activity in many cases with people who were more or less powerless to resist, has certainly become a scandal. I'll just say one more thing too, which is that the church is an organization unlike others that proclaims a belief in forgiveness and redemption. And that also affects the way in which perpetrators are viewed inside the church as opposed to inside the military or inside a workplace or inside the university. So I'm going to start by talking about some framing principles that I think can help us think and talk about this scandal as it affects the church as an organization. So I want to start by talking about consent as a framing principle. Many sources have sought to analyze the underlying causality of clerical sexual abuse by using what sociologists would call micro-level theories. That is, theories that try to explain what was wrong with the perpetrator. Was it psychological? Was it behavioral? Did it come from addiction? Did it deal from childhood experiences, and so on? So the John Jay report, as a good example, goes through a series of these micro-level explanations. But when sociologists see a behavior replicated over and over again in lots of different organizations and lots of times and places, then we begin to look for something outside the individual as an explanation. Now, that doesn't minimize the responsibility or culpability of individuals, but it does say that there may be other ways of looking at the problem that could be more fruitful. So I think that one way to think about that, at least in American society, is in terms of consent. Any kind of sexual activity against minors is prohibited in all 50 states and by the federal government, and in some cases that's by statutory rape, also by laws against child pornography and similar laws. Now, there's no question that that is a criminalized activity. And One of the reasons it's criminalized is that children cannot give consent. They don't understand in many cases what's happening, and if they did, they're still dependent upon adults. Now, I think we can extend this idea of consent to others, including church employees, male or female, seminarians, and others who, for various reasons, feel that their future is jeopardized if they say no to an unwanted sexual advance by somebody in the clergy. Indeed, if you take the argument of clericalism seriously, perhaps no lay Catholic can give consent because they feel bound to obey whatever they hear from their priest. I actually doubt there are very many Americans who still feel that way. But the shift to the consent criterion shifts our focus away from the perpetrator to think about the victims. And that is the thing that perhaps the bishops have been accused over and over again of not having done. They didn't pay attention to the victims. So I think it is helpful to look at consent. One more thing that will happen if we look at consent is that we will begin to change the focus not just from pedophilia or homosexuality. The John Jay report found that 20% of the victims were women, and it now appears that women are a greatly underrepresented demographic in clerical sexual abuse, including nuns. And we may begin to hear a great deal more of that. So the dioceses that have published, laudably I would say, the credible allegations against priests who have offended against minors are likely to find themselves in the batter's box once again, this time having to publish allegations against priests involving adults, and not just men, but also women. One other thing I would say about a focus on the victims is that another thing which angered the laity was the report that many victims were initially told, you can't talk about this to anybody, which locked them into their own isolation and frustration and guilt and blame. And in some cases, we had victims who committed suicide. A second framing principle that I now want not to propose but to reject is some kind of historicity, the view that if you look back to, let's say, the 1960s, you can say something happened. And that usually means that the crisis is getting hijacked for somebody's own political agenda. And that political agenda may be against homosexuality, it may be against Vatican II, whatever it is. There is an argument that there was once a golden age when this didn't happen, and then the bad thing happened, and now we have the scandal. That's probably not true. For one thing, the scandal appears to be very widespread. It's not just the United States. We know about it in Canada, Ireland, Australia, and many countries in Europe and in Latin America. So it doesn't seem that it's something limited to the United States. It's not limited to our century or the last century. We're beginning to see historical data, particularly from places like orphanages and residential schools, that suggest that this was a pattern that went on for a long time in the past. It's not something recent. But what is true is that general attitudes towards sexual behavior did change. And since I'm a demographer, I have to tell you candidly that we think what happened was that the FDA approved oral contraception in 1962. And that changed a lot of things. But even that, I would not say, is the reason for the scandal. The reason for the scandal is not to be found in something that is merely either historical or place-bound. Another framing principle I would reject is that it happens everywhere, and so we don't need to get excited about it in the church. It is true it happens everywhere. Yesterday there was a report out that said perhaps as many as 12,000 Boy Scouts had been abused by either volunteers or employees of that organization. School teachers, physicians, and others have also abused children. It's pretty widespread. But Americans are especially sensitive to hypocrisy and have been at least since colonial days. And the church is seen as peculiarly culpable because it enunciates such a clear and stated set of principles about about legitimate and moral sexual behavior. I mentioned before that I think another crucial element for the church is forgiveness of sins, and there's no other institution that proclaims that in the same way the Catholic Church does. The same confessional that can be used by an unscrupulous priest for abuse can also be used by that same priest for confession, repentance, and forgiveness. How we reconcile our belief in individual forgiveness with our institutional responsibility as a church is perhaps the crux of the dilemma. So it doesn't matter if sexual abuse happens in every institution in the society. The church is special in terms of her moral authority. And one of the additional victims of the sexual abuse crisis has been the sense of moral authority that the church exercised. So while I don't think the way ahead is altogether clear, I will say that other organizations do offer a model for efforts at reestablishing credibility, and that may be something that is helpful in the case of Catholicism. Certainly, reestablishing moral authority is important for the church to carry out her mission. So first among those, I would say it is incumbent upon members of the church to explain to one another what has changed. And by that I don't mean what caused the abuse, I mean what the reaction to the abuse has been and why that's been positive. So the Dallas 2002 protocol, I think, was an important step in the right direction. And it seemingly has worked as a preventive measure. I did a little back-of-the-envelope chi-square analysis of several dioceses and one archdiocese that had published lists of credible allegations against priests. And what I found was that there was much less reported after 2002 than there had been before. That suggests that there were a lot of resolutions of pending cases, and you saw that happening actually in 2002 itself. But it also suggests the dioceses went to work immediately to try and clear up their backlog and to be public about what they had done. But many of the laity are only dimly aware of these changes, but they're very aware of the allegations because it comes out constantly in the mass media. And so the Pennsylvania grand jury report last summer got devastating news coverage everywhere, even though many of those cases it reported not only predated the 2002 protocol, they predated Vatican II. Some cases they predated World War II. They went back a long way. That fact rather got glossed over in some of the media coverage of it. I've also read the accounts of several religious institutes and also several dioceses that make vague reassurances that we're doing everything we can. I think that falls on deaf ears with an increasingly cynical public. Reminding Catholics and the world at large of the changed procedures, especially as they affect the clergy, is really important. And let me say that gets more important in the future. I think both Dr. Reyes and I have mentioned the potential for more revelations. I believe now they will be about women, but that steady drip, drip, drip continues to hurt the church. One set of changes derived from the Dallas Protocol has been the specific training in ethics and integrity for lay volunteers in every ministry. Now, sometimes that is clumsily implemented in a way to suggest the laity were responsible for what happened. And that makes a lot of laity really angry, and they feel like they don't want to serve in any ministry if they're going to be viewed with suspicion. But rather than leave that implication, I think it's helpful to explain the reason. And the reason is that alert and well-trained lay volunteers change the environment. They reduce the opportunities for grooming behaviors by a potential priest predator. And it makes everyone alert to spaces and times when children could be vulnerable. That point is made abundantly clear to those who take the training, but it's not made clear to the entire congregation. One set of changes that would be helpful for lay Catholics to understand is changes in priestly formation. Many Catholic periodicals are advertising opportunities for vocations, but I think that those will be much more effective once parents understand what changed in seminaries and religious institutes. That there have been changes, I think, can be discerned in this fact. Priests ordained after 1979 are much less likely than those ordained earlier to be credibly accused of sexual misconduct, even though those priests ordained after 1979 had generally passed through the ages at which misconduct was most likely to occur. I checked this fact again with my little analysis of published lists, and priests ordained after 1979 are far less likely to be listed with credible allegations. So did something happen in screening in the seminaries? You kind of hear comments about that, but exactly what were those? That's by no means clear. Changing the work environment. So I've already noted that lay volunteers who are trained can change the environment for a would-be offender in the parish or in a school. And in general, any effort to make a parish more vigilant increases the difficulty of offending, whether by lay or clerical. Both the John Jay report and my own perusal of published allegations suggest that priests in religious institutes appear to be less likely to offend than diocesan clergy. In the John Jay report, it was a difference of an estimated 2.5% of religious order priests versus 4.3% of diocesan priests. Why is that true? It's not completely clear, but as a sociologist, it's something I would offer is worth further exploration. We know religious orders have different formation periods, different supervisory structures, and they're more likely to live in community. And these factors differ among religious orders, providing kind of a natural experiment for a way to study to see which of these things most creates an environment that's not conducive to offending. I think the nature of priestly living arrangements is worth further consideration. It appears that with the decline in priestly vocations, many diocesan clergy live alone in their rectories. And that happens as they often have additional parishes attached to their original parish as part of their responsibilities. The tendency in many dioceses has been to create cluster parishes, so fewer priests get more parishioners. Why not think about creating cluster rectories, where more priests live together even if they have to commute to their parishes? After all, most Americans commute to their jobs. Given the increased number of Catholics to serve, I think the current procedure tends to give overwhelming workloads to priests, and that creates what sociologists call a strain to deviance. That is an outlet for what seems like an overwhelming situation. I think it might be the case that the religious order clergy have greater resources, both in terms of personal support because they live in community, and organizational expertise because they have additional confreres to help them with the difficult parts of managing parishes or hospitals or whatever they do, but which also help to inhibit sexual deviance. I think the publication of lists of accused priests by diocese, although that might seem to hurt the church's credibility, has in fact boosted the credibility. It's been a willingness to acknowledge the issue publicly and talk about it. I think that a lot more could be done to explain to the public and to congregations how matters are handled when there is an allegation. For example, if you enunciate a zero tolerance policy, that's not really sufficient unless people know what it means. Did it imply that before you had a 10% tolerance? It's really hard to know what that means. What role do lay review boards play, and how would the members be selected? Is local law enforcement always notified, or under what circumstances is it notified? What's the practical difference in the terms that are used in these lists? So I read terms like resignation, restriction from active ministry, operating under a safety plan, laicization. Under what circumstances do these different consequences result? And under what circumstances are priests allowed to change their geographic location? And what safeguards are in place when that happens? There's inevitably going to have to be greater transparency about the financial aspects of the crisis. 18 dioceses and religious institutes are in bankruptcy, and their financial statements are very public. In fact, Professor Marie Riley at Penn State has a very nice archive which includes all the pleadings made in all those bankruptcy cases. The long-run cost to the church in terms of loss of property, loss of income, reduction in ministries, refused coverage by insurers and creditors, and other forms of financial harm all need to be understood. There are many calls for the laity to stop supporting the church financially, especially at levels above the local parish. And I think a better understanding of church finances is going to be part of the expected transparency. My own rather pessimistic assessment is that the Catholic Church in the near future is going to lose a number of landmark buildings and real estate, and perhaps even its investments that were earmarked for retirement funds and for maintenance. So to conclude, I believe that future histories of the church are going to point to the uncovering of clerical sexual abuse of such duration, extent, and gravity as a great crisis for the church. And a crisis can be understood as an opportunity for things to either get much better or much worse. It's far too late to worry about the church's reputation or whether the simple laity might get scandalized. Instead, it's time to take counsel about what are the prudential and morally right things to do. A large core of the laity is vitally concerned, and they are ready, for the time being, to be called upon for their assistance. There has never before been a time in the United States when there were so many Catholics who were well-educated, prominent in business and the professions, and capable of offering wise counsel. Continued recourse to the old habits of secrecy are not going to suffice this time. Few things matter more to the laity, who are the parents of our future congregations, than the safety and well-being of their children. If these parents do not believe their children are safe within the confines of the Catholic Church, there will be a historic exodus from American Catholicism.
Thank you, both of you, for those remarks. We will have about 30 minutes of question and answer, but I want to begin by asking a question for each of you. And either one of you can answer either one of these questions or both. But I think you will. Well, I'll just ask my questions. First, both of you spoke about the role of money and what we'd like to call in the church patrimony. How should, in your experience working in organizations, either large secular organizations or Catholic organizations, what advice can you offer, with all the usual disclaimers, to bishops and priests, but especially bishops who have to balance their obligations to protect the patrimony of the diocese for the current and future generations, most of whom are totally innocent of the crimes that have been committed, with questions of justice and obligations to those who have legitimate claims against the archdiocese? How do you balance the need to be a pastor, to be open and transparent, and to ask forgiveness with legitimate concerns about mitigating liability? How do you balance that? And the second question is, with both of you having experience in organization, and here, Dr. Sullivan, I'm thinking of you mostly, most bishops have communications teams around them. You have both been around organizations that have experienced significant sort of media shocks. There was events at the University of Virginia where we were trying to figure out whether the reports in the Rolling Stone article, for example, were true. How do you know how to respond? What guidance do you look to know that you're responding correctly to serious concerns without legitimizing a false narrative or underestimating the gravity of claims made against the institution? And obviously, you've been with the USCCB through this. I know it's not your primary portfolio, but you've been around that over the last 10 months. How do you grapple with that, and what advice do you have for how to think through those things clearly?
Okay, well, let's start with the money question. So, in truth, the decision may be removed from bishops. You know, we may end up with courts making orders and judgments about what parts of the patrimony can be preserved and what can't. But I will say in general, Americans don't understand endowments, or patrimony, if you wish. And, you know, the University of Virginia is fortunate to have a large endowment. It's one of the things that lets us make up for the fact that the state contribution diminishes every year. But explaining to the public what that endowment is very tough to do. It's not a piggy bank. You can't reach into it for any good purpose. Most of that money has been earmarked in perpetuity by the donors. The same is also true with much of the money that the bishops are managing. And again, most people don't understand it. What they do understand is things like pension funds. They get that because many of them are also invested in pension fund. So they can understand why that needs to be preserved for that good purpose. So I think that, you know, more clarity around diocesan financial statements, and you know, many parishes are already pretty good about being pretty open about their financial statements. I think that that's really important. I think that real estate, works of art, that kind of thing, I think that's going to be what people go after in bankruptcy, just because those are tangible assets and an external appraiser would be able to assess them. And I think that will continue to happen. I think there'll have to be some reevaluation of just exactly what the church needs to carry on. And there was a day in this country when we didn't have fine church buildings, and we still had an active Catholic Church. We may be going back to that day. I hate to be pessimistic about it, but I am. Let me reserve the media question for a minute and give Dr. Reyes a chance to answer that question.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate that. In terms of the money thing, and I've spoken to so many bishops and people about things, I think that the point that it'll largely be taken out of bishops' hands is plausible, particularly with statute of limitations kind of reconsideration of those things. But let me just sound naive a bit and perhaps hyper-spiritual in this. It strikes me that given the church's fundamental task is to bear witness to the redemption of Christ, that the principle that would dictate prudential judgments, or a principle or a primary principle that would dictate both the question of how much do you work to preserve things as they are financially versus transparency, or how much do you work in the way you communicate to get a narrative out there versus perhaps some kind of transparency. I think the church just simply has to err, given what it is and what its mission is, on the side of transparency. I think truth is going to come at a cost. I don't think Dr. Sullivan is being overly pessimistic. Truth is going to come at a financial cost. But the principle needs to be transparency and truth if this thing that the church and its mission is going to continue. So that's my sort of overly simplistic and perhaps piocious answer to that.
Well, so for the media question, for those of you who didn't have any reason to be keeping count of this, Rolling Stone in November of 2014 published a cover article alleging a quite lurid gang rape by a fraternity at the University of Virginia of an undergraduate woman. And it instantly went viral worldwide, but it wasn't true. And yet it put us in a very difficult situation for a lot of reasons, because undercutting the accounts of victims or survivors is one of the things people have done for years to try and keep sexual abuse from being dealt with. We didn't want to be in that position. So our public stance was to enunciate our principle clearly, which is, we expect you to be safe when you're at our university, and we'll do everything we can do to ensure your safety. The second was to show empathy for the victim, and we had, in fact, offered her a variety of accommodations, including counseling and the use of a service animal and other things to try and help her get through this. And then to enunciate clearly the actions you're going to take, which in our case was an investigation. And I asked our board to hire a firm themselves, not me, to do the investigation, because I didn't want to be in the position of investigating myself. Okay, so that's what we did. We did some other things as well. And so because of FERPA, federal law protecting privacy of students, we couldn't actually talk about the specific case. And because of confidentiality, I couldn't either talk about the employees who might have been at fault here. So I was kind of silenced on the specifics here. But our local police chief wasn't, and so I called him first thing that morning, and I said, "Chief, this magazine alleges that a crime happened in your jurisdiction. I'm going to ask you to investigate that crime." Because I knew, and the police chief knew, that we had taken this young woman to the police on 3 different occasions, and each time she refused to cooperate. I couldn't say that, and the only reason I can tell you that is because he issued a report in which he said that, so I'm quoting him. And so his report came out, but by that time the Washington Post had gone in and they'd basically unraveled the story. And this young woman is very troubled, and I do think something traumatic happened to her, but it wasn't what she described. Well, in any event, once the story unraveled and got reversed, and the people who'd been really angry and upset kind of dissipated, but I decided to go ahead with reform actions that I thought would be useful, even though the story wasn't true. It was a great opportunity for us, I thought, to put into effect all the best practices we could. So we convened a large commission which had parents and alumni, undergraduate and graduate students, faculty and staff, to come together and examine the university's culture and come up with things that we thought would be useful changes. There were a lot of changes made. Some of them were little, some of them were big. and some of them were out of the box. So students told us on the weekends there was nothing to do but get drunk. And we decided that was something we could remedy, and we did. And we now have every weekend all kinds of activities for the students which don't involve alcohol, and they're very happy with that. And the instance of alcohol offending has gone down pretty substantially. That has an indirect effect because in a large percentage of student-on-student sexual assault issues, alcohol is involved. But anyway, to go back to my original point, enunciate the principle, you express empathy for the victim, you talk about what actions you're going to take. In the first media shock, that's about all you can do. To the extent it's possible, get out in front of it. Right now, the bishops can get out in front of the issue of women who've been abused. That's what they should be doing.
We will open it up now for questions from the audience. Please raise your hand. Our microphone passer-arounder is not with us right now, so if you have a question, please stand up and walk up to the microphone and ask your question there. In the form of a question, please.
Thanks. Is this clear?
Yes, yes.
My name's Henry Borger. I'm a mechanical engineer. I went to Catholic University, but I have no special knowledge about religion. My question is, have either of you read Pope Benedict's, former Pope Benedict's, dissertation essay on the problem that we've been discussing?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you, Mr. Borger. I did read it in preparation for talking about this myself, and this paper is heavily footnoted. If you read my footnotes, which you didn't have a chance to do, you'd see that I quoted that paper in some parts, and not favorably, because he does try to locate the problem at a historical moment, which I think is incorrect. And he also emphasizes homosexuality and pedophilia. That doesn't explain the 20% of the cases that are women. And so I found it to be an incomplete analysis of the problem. On the other hand, I think it's always helpful when church authorities are taking the issue seriously and thinking about it. And he did have, I think, also some very thoughtful comments about it. Teresa?
No, I read it well. I read it as well. Are we on? So, no, yeah, absolutely read it. I actually think we don't have yet, what we're missing in the church right now is a sort of, and this has been very helpful hearing Dr. Sullivan, because we need a somewhat more comprehensive answer to the question of where the heck did this come from. And I think that currently, as I argued in the paper, without the help of some other fields, including sociology, we need a sort of narrative of some sort of coherent analysis, and it's being sidetracked right now. So a lot of the response to Benedict's analysis, some of it came from a certain kind of sociological critique. Some of it was just, this can't be true. And so my argument from it is basically, it's an opportunity to make the conversation actually get some teeth to it. I'm actually not against having any number of possible causes proposed and maybe dismissed later. But I just don't think we have a comprehensive view of what went wrong. So it was a welcome contribution to the conversation in that sense.
Can I have a follow-up question?
Hmm?
I read the paper about a week ago, and my reaction to it was that Judge Judy has that famous line where she says, "Don't pee on my foot and tell me it's raining." Well, after reading that, I kind of got the idea that the Catholic Church has been telling me it's raining now for 50 years. And he mentioned that there was a very fundamental shift in the attitude of the Catholic Church towards faith and morals as a result of Vatican II. Maybe that's widely known. It wasn't widely known to me. It wasn't known to me. Basically, he said that there was a decision made that all the teachings of the church, both faith and morals, would be based on Scripture, and that they made an effort to develop a set of morals based on Scripture, and found out that you could not get there from here. That if you did away with natural law, that you weren't going to have any coherent body of knowledge about morality. As a result, morality is almost never discussed in my churches, in any of the churches I go to. We get a reading, of course, for the day, and then we get a sermon on the readings of that day. I cannot remember the last time we had anything having to do with morality preached about in my church, and I have to think that is the Pope is right. That is a major reason why we have so many problems today, and that all of our discussion so far, and this is my third session with this group, has been tinkering with the nuts and bolts of the problem, and not to the basic problem that somehow or other the Catholic Church has done away with morality. Could you comment on that?
Go ahead, yours.
No, I'm going to appeal to my disclaimers. There are various narratives about what happened in moral theology after Vatican II, many of which I've read, none of which I'm theologically sophisticated enough to evaluate. So that's a story that's out there, and it's true. In terms that story exists, and it's told, and I thought we actually had one of the sessions where that was actually treated by, was it Dr. Pecknell? The second incompetency I'll claim is one of the things, the letters you most often read working for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops is letter that starts, I go to church and I never hear from the pulpit, ... Whether it's moral, whether it's concern for the poor, those are the ones I tend to get, the concern for the poor ones. And all I can say is, as laity, it is very important, given the reality of priestly life, that if we want them to speak on things, that we encourage our priests to consider these things, and that when they do, we actually praise them for it, because most of them are just critiqued. So I think there's just a pastoral thing from the laity side. We're not going to control what priests preach about. We're not going to do seminary formation that leads to it. But there isn't a priest I know who doesn't appreciate laity encouraging them to take a bold stance on something or to make an honest comment from the pulpit, because most of what they get is just negative.
I think there are moments when sexual morality is addressed. In Catholic high schools, for example, there's customarily a course on it. In marriage preparation, there's nearly always considerable discussion about it. But I think it's true you don't hear about it much from the pulpit. I read much of Benedict's commentary as kind of inside baseball for theologians, including the part where he talks about seminarians being forbidden to read his work and so on. And so I knew at that point I didn't understand what was going on. And I also cannot comment about what might or might not have happened with moral theology after Vatican II.
My name is Father Joseph Van House. I'm in the theology doctoral program here at CUA. Thank you both for your presentations, which were very helpful. I wanted to ask especially Dr. Sullivan about your helpful thoughts about how to present effectively what the church has done. Already what you've said has been really good from the point of view of the question I'm about to ask, but I'd love to hear you say more, which is that so often there is this ironic response to attempts to articulate the successes, that they seem to be dismissive of the actual problems, or that they seem to be, in any attempts to offer a defense of the church or an articulation of what we are doing right or correcting some media accounts in certain cases. Mm-hmm. How it is that we can offer an explanation that is truthful and that is really well received versus simply always remaining in a stance of full penitence with no explanation and no discussion of results.
Right. And I think in justice to the overwhelming majority of priests who are true to their vows, it's an important thing to do. And it is hard to do when you're seen as being defensive, which is the position that clergy and bishops find themselves in. Myself, since I'm a sociologist, I would like to see a few sociologists who've got real credentials in this area do some analysis of what changed in the churches, particularly in priestly formation, and what effect that might have had. That's a study that could be done. The advantage of that is that it's seen as a more or less independent analysis that then can get picked up by the media to the extent they're ever interested in good news, which not all that often, at least get picked up in the Catholic media. But right now, if you ask me, a quasi-well-informed layperson, my parish is run by Paulist fathers. If you ask me, what have the Paulists done in changing priestly formation, I don't have any idea. Couldn't possibly tell you. And I do think there's just room in websites and parish bulletins and otherwise to say, have you ever wondered how priests are trained these days? Well, here's a list. I just think that would be astonishingly helpful. And occasionally you'll read a story about, seminarians being exposed to various ministries and so on. The more we can do of that, the better. Also, I think, until there is more discussion about what it's actually like to be in the seminary, it's going to be that much harder to persuade young men that that's life they ought to consider. Because if they don't know anything about it, how can they make a decision about it? The U.S. Army goes to extraordinary lengths in advertising what it's like to be Army strong. We don't do nearly the same thing with what it's like to be a priest of God. So I think there are a lot of venues that could be tried, but first of all, you've got to acknowledge it's an issue and then think about how do we tell this story if we needed to tell it. And if I were going to pick a particular audience I would aim at, it would be mothers. I think mothers in particular need to hear this story.
I would just add one thing from some surveying we've done. The possibility of the kind of response you're talking about, I'm sure you've seen Peter Steinfeld's article on the Pennsylvania Grand Jury Report. If you haven't, you should look at it. But because that was a national response of the kind you're talking. But the thing I'd say is, to your point, Dr. Sullivan, which I think is just important, where there's room for that kind of response is, at the moment, more local. It's in the parish, it's in the particular diocese maybe, but it's in the parish, because that's where there's enough trust to where it's likely that telling the truth about these things won't just simply be assumed to be defensive. So I think the opportunity is likely to be in the local in the short run.
My name is Carlos Salinas. I'm a parishioner at Holy Trinity and a member of the Parish Pastoral Council there. I want to connect with the conference here in February and also with Lumen Gentium and ask you for some feedback. Lumen Gentium, of course, recognizes the role of the laity, the co-responsibility of the laity within the church, while at the same time reminding us that the rulers, their exact words in the English translation, are the priests. In one of the afternoon presentations, one of the professors did place it in history in terms of a never-ending problem. And I believe that it's a non-ending threat. Where there are children, there will be predators, and where there are vulnerable people, there will be predators. The final presentation, and this is where I hope to get your feedback and tying it all together, in the question of what can the laity do. Dr. Michael Root talked about, reminded us again, that the laity also exercises the priestly, prophetic, and kingly functions. Reminded us of that, as Lumen Gentium makes clear over and over again. In that, he said that he found that there was very little theological guidance on the issue of laity and governance. And I asked him to follow up about that, and he reiterated. He said it could be wrong, but there seemed to be a lacuna there. And so my question is, as it all ties in, we are told, it's suggested to us that laity should always continue to insist. But for me, the gorilla in the middle of the room is the laity is still, however, all the words of co-responsibility, involvement, duty, what have you, it's still strictly in an advisory capacity. And in February, if I didn't misunderstand it, the canon law expert pretty much went through all of canon law, it seemed, pointing out all these rights and responsibilities of the laity to provide advice. And to me, to provide advice and to actually decide are two very, very different matters. So I'd like to hear your reflections on that. Put it in another way, we discern, but they decide. So could you give us some feedback on that, please? Thank you.
I work for the bishops. No, let me speak from my field, which is history. This is a great question. I think that analysis of canon law is consistent with all the secondary sources I've read by canon lawyers. So I don't think there's anything in there. But I would simply point out this. Historically, laity have had, usually by custom, governing authority. So it's been the change that's developed that we sort of live with is a change of the last, say, 200 years. So for many years, say from Constantine to the 19th century, it was not uncommon for powerful laity to, heck, call ecumenical councils, let alone approve bishops or recommend people for being bishops. They couldn't ordain them, but they did these kinds of things. And it was in the right of lay leaders when this is largely because it was a Christian civilization. So it was largely the case that laity exercised governing, decision-making type authority, and occasionally even when it came to concordats and other things, or with the mission overseas, Spain's role in the expansion of Christianity to the New World, tremendous amount of governance authority. For various reasons, complex reasons, and I'd recommend in particular the historians John O'Malley and Russ Hittinger on this, that has narrowed. One of the reasons for that narrowing they trace to developments around Vatican I and Vatican II, the loss of the Christian nation state, cultural shifts to the privatization of religion. If religion simply becomes where individual souls are cared for, the care of individual souls really is a priestly duty in a particular way. And so if the mission ad gentes outside is reduced, you're going to see less lay governing effort in these things. I say that only because I think that story, with a little better understanding, could help the conversation where we're at. I don't know where it's going. I can't solve the canon law problem. So I acknowledge it and just hopefully add a little bit of context.
And I know a good bit less than Dr. Reyes. But what I would say is that I think in the U.S. context, we do have a couple of things that complicate that general sweep he gave. One was the trustee controversy in the very early days of the American church. And another was our own democratic background. The laity who had the most influence in Europe tended to be nobles and royals. And we have a shortage of those, which is a good thing. And so, which laity are the ones who get to give advice? On the other hand, I would say no bishop today is going to run a hospital without having physicians to provide advice. I think in the same way, we've seen some steps forward in ways that other professionals get called upon to give advice. I believe the lay review boards with this particular issue are, one way that I guess the discernment is maybe almost rising to the level of decision. And I think that publicizing who's on those boards and how they get chosen and what their terms are and so on would be all to the good. There may well be some other areas where bishops in particular would benefit from additional advisory boards. I do think one thing the laity can do in their parishes, as I mentioned in my paper, is to help create a safe parish environment. They're there around the parish plant all the time, and they're able to make sure that there aren't any little closets that you could pull a kid into, or other sorts of situations that are potentially dangerous to somebody who's vulnerable. It is true that you are always going to have some potential perpetrators drawn to situations where there are lots of vulnerable people, but you can patrol the environment so it makes it much harder to do anything in that situation, and that's something I believe that the laity are able to do.
I'd like to just add one thought, because thank you, Dr. Sullivan. You reminded me of something. Consultation can seem weak, and this was, I think the Archbishop was getting at this earlier. But at least in terms of abuse stuff, to the extent the consultation involves the full sharing of information, it actually has some teeth to it. So to the extent they are lay people who know accusations, what the accusations are, how they're being considered, even if they don't make the final decision, that is an exertion of a certain kind of, that's more than just you get to give your opinion on a Tuesday. And so co-responsibility, if it means anything, and I don't know that this would bump into canon law, I have no authority to say so, co-responsibility at a minimum involves the sharing of information, the fullness of the information with at least some group of laity. And to the extent we can do those kinds of things, that will at least strengthen, I think, a certain kind of accountability.
Thank you to our two panelists. Please join me in thanking Dr. Sullivan and Dr. Reyes.